the MessianTics podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now, here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of MessianTics. Today, we're going to kick off a conversation that was discussed in our group chat that Toby has brought up in the past about the fact that if you know Paul's words better than Yeshua's, then you've got a problem. Largely, this is just because there's so much Christian doctrine that is built around Paul's epistles, and it's kind of difficult sometimes, for people to actually break away and see, like, oh, wow, I know a lot of Paul's words, but maybe not necessarily Yeshua's. So one of the couple of the statements that come with that is, why don't we treat all epistles with the same reverence? Sure, there are a lot of doctrines established by Paul, but we've got 3 letters from John, 2 that are ascribed to Peter, we've got, Jude, we've got James or Yaakov.
1, 2, 3, John.
Yeah, which are my favorites. Just because Paul wrote a bunch doesn't mean the others have less value.
Yeah.
The other is you can't base doctrine off the black and white texts and epistles, as each one was addressing specific problems in specific communities at specific times. So not everything extrapolates as easily as we'd like to pretend it could, which is true. They're all, this is always, for me anyway, it's always kind of funny when people want to lay hold to the epistles, one, as doctrinal treatises, which if you've read theological treatises from that time period, these they don't fit the format for what we would call for doctrinal treatises. Yeah. They're too informal, first of all. They greet people. Like Paul will be in the middle of like, hey, by the way, like we know this is how God works with this thing. But by the way, say hi to Phyllis for me.
Yeah.
So I actually love Paul for that reason, because when I'm speaking and teaching, lots of times something will just jump in my head and I'll break away and say, hey, what about that?
Someone walks into service late, you're like, oh, hey, good to see you.
Good to see you. And
Paul's like, speaking of people that are trained, hey, Phyllis, make sure you say hi to Phyllis. No.
That's right. Speaking of sinners, hey, Bob,
so there is this kind of strange thing that so much is built up around what some would call Pauline doctrines, just as a way of ascribing the mindset of using Paul's letters to format doctrine. I will say historically, this is not a long-term problem. This is a post-Lutheran problem. Because, for example, like I know some of y'all have read on things like the new... there's Paul within Judaism is a big new wave of academic study of Paul as a Pharisee.
Yeah,
today,
which really kind of trails on the back of the deep study on kind of reviving Yeshua as a Jew, within Judaism.
Well, and the Paul specifically comes from in the 60s and 70s, kind of with the explosion of the Messianic movement. There is the new. I forget what it's called, the new perspective on Paul. So there is a new perspective on Paul that's kind of born out of the same time period the Messianic world is growing. Ironically, they're not connected. The Messianic world is kind of growing on itself. The new perspective on Paul, which is examining Paul within contemporary Jewish understanding, that begins developing kind of as its own thing within biblical literature, within academia. A couple different authors really push that. There's a couple good books written on that. And that is born out of what, of course, with that, the older perspective, which is called, the old perspective on Paul. But it really isn't, it's not, we call it the old perspective in academia, but it isn't. It's only about 500 years old. This idea of taking Paul's letters and, building doctrine out of those solely. And this, of course, really comes off the back of really post-Anglican gatherings of believers, because Luther, when he begins, his intention was not to leave Roman Catholicism. Many of them were not trying to. Of course, later on you get people like Calvin who definitely are trying to leave Roman Catholicism. You have the Anglican Church, which breaks away on its own under Henry VIII, sorry. And then within England, you have reformers in England who are trying to they're like, well, this doesn't seem right. Like, there's a lot of things with this church that, we can't line up with biblically or whatever.
Yeah, and that's only when you're dealing with the Western.
Yeah, realistically.
Church,
like, the East really doesn't have this problem. But the Western Church definitely does. And we see this a lot when it comes to the separatists in England, the Puritans, which are kind of the forebears of much of the U.S.'s, the American view of religion, of church organization, going back and having to kind of figure out for yourself how to run a congregation. And Paul's letters provide, and that's what Paul does. Paul is writing a lot of these letters to help these brand new, and some of them aren't brand new. Some of them are brand new Messianic congregations, but they're born out of the synagogues in their local communities. They start with Jewish believers, some God-fearers who are there, but of course Gentiles begin coming in, and so suddenly you have this massive shift, and he's trying to he's going right alongside with what his rabbi did when he was under Gamaliel, because we have, Gamaliel wrote letters to external Jewish communities on guidance on how to function. And so he's, a good disciple and is following right along with that. But they aren't using them as doctrinal theological treatises. Was never their intention. And I think we do make a mistake when we rely on them as, like, most of us have, like, what we believe section on our websites. When we treat Paul's letters as what we believe, it's like, well, there's more to it, first of all. You kind of can do some, like, deductive reasoning with Paul's letters of, like, what we do and don't believe, but to use that as, like, the final stake, it lands you in weird places.
Yeah. Right. Paul's writings largely are, well, first of all, just because Paul wrote a lot doesn't make his stuff more important. It also doesn't make it less important.
Yeah.
We do the same thing when we talk about the greater and lesser prophets of the Tanakh. Because we use the word greater to talk about the larger books, not that the prophet is actually greater, but that the volume of writing is more.
Sorry, Jonah.
But these prophetic books are just as important in prophecy. God's word is just as important regardless who speaks it or how much is said in that particular prophetic word. So, we look at Isaiah or Hosea and we see different lengths of books, but it doesn't make one more important. But we've done the same thing to Paul that we did to those books, and Paul becomes the greater prophet, so to speak, of the New Covenant writings, apostolic writings, and the others are lesser.
Yeah.
But when you really think about it, for instance, Paul submitted in authority to Yaakov. The book of James or the book of Yaakov is the first or the earliest book in the Brit Chadashah written by somebody that Paul submitted himself to.
Yeah, right.
So if you were doing it in hierarchy, you would say, well, is the book of Yaakov or James more important than Pauline Epistles based just upon authority? And so you go through there. The other thing is that Paul's writings are largely explanations of how we walk, halakhic writings, rather than doctrinal writing. In other words, Paul's not sharing about God or creation, those kind of things in that format. He's sharing about, okay, we have a group of people that are doing something. How are we supposed to walk out our faith? How is this halakha applied to me and our community? And what's important is, in order for a halakhic argument or decision to apply to you, all of the aspects of that decision should apply to you. Now, you can take other parts and say, well, this may apply or this is. But in other words, if you're not doing the same things the same way, then all of the ruling doesn't apply to you, and therefore shouldn't be broadly applied to everyone, just the people in that condition. Which is why when we read in Romans, it talks about, or Galatians, and talks about circumcision, and almost seems to downplay its importance in talking to the people in Galatia, because their problem had to do with trying to force non-Jews to be circumcised in order to be part of the body.
Right.
Where when we read in Romans by the same author, what value is circumcision? Much in every way.
Yeah.
So depending on who it's written to makes a big difference on whether it's applicable in your life. And we have cherry-picked too much of Paul's writings. In that way, and then made them applicable, like, Paul says you don't have to be circumcised, so circumcision was done away with by Paul as a New Testament belief system. But that's not at all what Paul says.
Likewise, the reality is Paul's letters, at least in my estimation, Paul's letters do not appear to be, as Jonathan was saying earlier, intended to be doctrinal statements. But rather, as we said in talking about, we did a whole episode on Romans and an episode on Ephesians. Each of Paul's letters are dealing with a specific issue that a specific community of believers is dealing with. And so he's addressing that. And it's important to keep it in that context. Are there doctrinal things that we can extrapolate from it? Sure. But he wasn't writing them to be doctrinal, and sometimes we blow things out of proportion. And as Rabbi Eric was saying, when we're looking at the prophets from the Tanakh, right? You've got your quote unquote major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then all your minor prophets. But what nobody really pays attention to, because of the descriptors that we've attached to them, is you have realistically 3 time periods being addressed by Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Isaiah is pre-Babylonian captivity. It's actually written as the northern kingdom is dealing with Assyrian onslaught and captivity, and so some of it is addressing the northern kingdom, but it's also written addressing the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, saying, hey, you're going to experience the same thing from the Babylonians if you don't get your stuff together, right? So it's pre-Babylonian captivity. Then we have Jeremiah, and Jeremiah is a prophet sent to the southern kingdom in the early phases or at the beginning of Babylonian onslaught, and then the early Babylonian captivity, right? And then you've got Ezekiel, and Ezekiel is written in Babylonian captivity. And so in order to understand any of those 3, you have to understand the period of Israel's history in which they're written and the issues that are being addressed at those points in time, because that matters. Likewise, the quote-unquote minor prophets, they're not minor, they're not lesser than, but rather they're all in they're contemporaries of those 3, and they fall somewhere in that same time frame. So in order to understand them, we have to read them in that same time frame and historical context, and in alignment with what those others are talking about. We can do the same thing with Pauline Epistles or with any of the epistles. We can look at the time frame, because all of them were written in similar time frames, right? And so we can look at where John's writing his epistles, look at the time frame for each of them, loosely line them up with the time frame that Paul was writing his, and see, what issues are there issues they're carrying over. So we can go, okay, well, Paul deals with circumcision in Galatians, and then he deals with it again in Romans. Well, is that a wide berth issue in the first century body of Messiah, or was this something specific to these communities that he's trying to address? One being the letter to the Galatians, which seemed to have a kind of puffed up over emphasized view of circumcision, and then in Romans where it seemed like there was a de-emphasized view of circumcision. And so we can go, okay, well, John's letters or James or what have you that are written, James being first or Yaakov, his letter being first, but we can look at these other epistles, line them up in the time frame, and get a perspective of, is this a widespread issue? And if so, okay, well, then what do we take away from this? Or was Paul dealing with 2 separate communities that had 2 separate issues, and he was trying to address just those, at which point we can extrapolate exactly what he's intending from it then, rather than making a massive doctrinal statement that wasn't intended there. And the fact, and this goes back to what really started this whole conversation, was Rabbi Toby's statement that far too many believers can quote Paul all day long, and they build their entire faith basis off of Paul's writings. And yet most of them, if you were to read something that was in the red letters in a red letter Bible to them, they would have no clue who to attribute that to. And often, if it seems like it kind of goes in a contrary direction than Paul's writings, they'd be completely confused. That can't be biblical. That must be Old Testament. That must be... But yet our faith is built on Yeshua. So why is it that we're so heavily weighted in balance towards Paul rather than Yeshua, or as we said earlier, the other authors of the epistles, or what have you? It's important for us to really put, and this isn't to water down Paul. Yeah. This isn't to water down his words. He had a lot to say that was very valuable. I'm very appreciative of the Pauline letters, but we have to keep them in context of who he is. Paul was a teacher. He was a rabbi. He was an apostle. He was a shaliach. He was not Messiah.
Yeah, and in saying that, it's important that at least the people at this table believe that Paul's writings are inspired by the Ruach HaKodesh.
Correct.
They are scriptures, so we're not diminishing their value in doing this, but we're also not overemphasizing Paul's writings to the point where they supersede Moses or supersede Isaiah or anybody before, or supersede Yeshua or any of the other writers of the Brit Chadashah.
I don't even like the word supersede, because it's like it's all supposed to work in conjunction together.
Exactly.
And it's nothing...
Right, line upon line, not one is higher or more valuable than the other.
Yeah, and it's, and there's, different ones can have different values at different time depending on what you're dealing with or going through. For example, if you're struggling with congregational discipline, maybe you should do a study through some of the epistles of Paul. Not to say you shouldn't go through the other epistles as well, but they all cover different things. But if you're dealing with people issues, Paul, just sit with Paul and his letters for a while. They'll provide some guidance. You're trying to teach new believers, who are, let's say, coming to your synagogue and are trying to learn the basics of Torah. Start them in Genesis, or Deuteronomy. Either one. You could, start them in either of those books. They have different. Depending on where you start, is going to lead to different places faster. But that doesn't mean that because you start in Deuteronomy, Genesis is less important. Or if you start in Genesis, that Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomies are less important. Just because you start in Matthew. I know I can't tell you how many Bible websites try to start in John. You go to a Bible website, and no, I get why. Normally it's to throw John 3 and John 30:16 specifically to make that the first thing people see. It's almost like this it's it's kind of like this Hail Mary almost of a throw of maybe if that's the one verse they see, they'll come to faith. But they all have different places. The Bible has different functional literature within it. You have wisdom literature. You have prophetic literature, apocalyptic literature, poetic. It's all of it has a different place and meaning depending on who's reading it, who's receiving it from a teacher, and the teacher's teaching it. And context does matter. Like Rabbi Eric's books. Everything in context, which will one day be a full series, a complete set, I'm sure.
It's working on it.
We're almost done.
The other thing to remember in this discussion is that in the context of the full Bible, for instance, Paul says in one place, this very well-known, over-quoted verse about women being silent in the congregation. But if you take that verse out of the context of the entire Bible, then you lose the fact that Deborah was given authority by God to speak to the entire nation as an authority and a judge over Israel. So you can't be silent in the congregation, in the community. And remember, the word congregation there is talking about community, not just a gathering of people there. Here's Deborah given the authority by God to be the judge of the entire nation, speaking his decisions in authority to the entire nation. So you have to find out, okay, why was Paul saying this at this time? And then if that situation that Paul was addressing isn't in your community, if you're not dealing with that situation, then maybe this statement shouldn't be broad brushed over every woman everywhere for all time.
Right.
And that's one of the problems we have with this. Yeshua tells a woman, go and tell.
Yeah.
He changed her life and says, go tell. Wait, did he just violate the women keep silent in your community rule by telling a woman to go basically preach to those what happened to her? Of course not. But we have, and by we I mean everybody outside this room, have taken Paul's writings.
Because we are perfect.
That's right, because we are, in essence. No, but we've taken Paul's writings and given them a authority that they were never intended to have in the way we apply them. Not that they weren't
they're intended to be authoritative,
right?
Just not
in the way that we put them up.
Well, it's like, and this is going to sound kind of bad, but here it is.
It's what we go for.
Yeah. I have I have different friend group chats. Group chat A and group chat B receive completely different jokes and memes because they're different people. They're different groups, and some of them have a sense of humor that can take certain things. Some of them don't take well.
And that's things. Like communicating with my wife. Like there's a certain way I'll text my wife.
Right.
I'm not going to text that to Toby. Right. It's just not that it doesn't work the same, right?
Right. And not only that, but we do things, and by we, I'm now talking about preachers, rabbis, pastors, where someone in our congregation will do something, and they may or not even be in the congregation, but we'll preach at those that are present as if they're involved in whatever that is.
Yeah.
They used to call it preaching to the choir. You have all the people that are actually doing right and being right or trying to are in your congregation, and the people you're preaching at aren't there, but you're trying, and they're sitting there going, well, am I doing this? Do I not know that I'm let me check my heart.
Why am I receiving this tongue lashing?
Right. And so that's really what we do when we take Paul's writings out of the context and intent of Paul's letter, which was correction of a group of people doing a certain thing at a certain time. And then we broad brush that as if that was Paul writing that word to everybody everywhere who may not be involved in whatever sin or failure or falling short Paul's addressing. And then those people are like, well, maybe I need to look at my heart. Maybe I'm doing something hidden. I don't know. Maybe there's sin in, and the truth is there probably is sin in our life, but it's probably not that one or that thing. But we can cause people to stumble or even give up because we're misapplying text. And we do this a lot with Paul's writings. You don't hear as much of this from the writings of, like, the book of 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, which is all about loving people and
Gnosticism.
Yeah, these are different things that are going on in there, and you don't hear as much of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, or Timothy.
Yeah,
Timothy gets preached a lot when you're dealing with leadership.
Still a Pauline letter, though.
Yeah, yeah, but you don't hear people talking about that like you do.
Yeah.
Galatians or Romans or Colossians, Ephesians, in that way. The other letters, you're not hearing him preach that as much as you do with those particular things.
And it's important to note, too, we call this the MessianTics podcast, and so we talk about a lot of the antics that exist within Messianic Judaism, but also within the relationship of Messianic Judaism and the greater body of Messiah, right? And a lot of what we're talking about today in the overinflation of not only whether or not there are doctrinal statements intended within Pauline letters, but in particular the overinflation of Paul's words themselves, taken out of context, spun every which way, and made to say whatever we want, is honestly at the root of a lot of the problematic relationships that can exist between Messianic Judaism and the greater body of Messiah, as the greater body of Messiah tends to look at Messianic Judaism, which in in the most simplified definition I can come up with, is a revival of what the first century body of Messiah actually looked like. And so the greater body of Messiah, which in a lot of ways, intentionally or unintentionally, in a lot of ways is very anti-Judaism, not anti-Jewish people. There are anti-Semitic tendencies within certain aspects of the church. I'm not saying the church itself is specifically anti-Semitic, but there is an anti-Judaism attitude that exists within a lot of the church, right? We love the imagery of Pesach, of Passover, and so we talk about Passover and the Holy Week and all this leading up to Easter. But the fact of the matter is most of the church could care less about the fact that what we're reading in the Brit Chadashah and the New Covenant writings is very literally Jewish life being expressed before us. Yeah. And so in a lot of ways, the greater body of Messiah uses a lot of Paul's writings, particularly Galatians and parts of Romans out of context, parts of Corinthians, etc., as ammunition against Messianic Judaism, as a reason why Messianic Judaism is not a valid expression of faith in Yeshua, and so on and so forth. But the ultimate reality is they're taking, for instance, Galatians, which deals with a specific issue and a specific community at a specific time. We can extrapolate valuable information from that and how to live our life and faith in Messiah out in everyday practice, but we'll take that out of context and then use it as a accusation or a trial, if you would, against Messianic Judaism. So Messianic Judaism often finds ourselves kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place because we're a part of the body of Messiah, right. But the body of Messiah often doesn't want us. We're part of Judaism, and Judaism often doesn't want us. And so we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place in a lot of ways, and a lot of it on both sides, Judaism and the body of Messiah, is because we're looking at things in Scripture in the wrong way and viewing it from the wrong light and coming out with a wrong perspective because of it. And it can often be very problematic and painful. I mean, you just look at, you brought up Paul talking about women remaining quiet and so on, which has nothing to do with what people make it out to be. But what about the 1 Corinthians where he talks about head coverings? Right, and everybody loves to beat up on a dude. You watch believers. You go to a ball game. You can pretty quickly tell who grew up in a very traditional evangelical home, because as soon as somebody starts to pray, they all take their ball caps off. Right? You go to it's this whole thing. We got to take our ball cap off if we're praying, because Paul says not to have your head covered or whatever. Right? But the reality is that's not what he was dealing with. And he goes on in the same chapter to explain in context what he was talking about, which was hair. And he was saying a dude should look like a dude and a chick should look like a chick. I mean, that was pretty much all he was getting at. And how you define that, how you work that out in your own, that's between you and God. I don't really care. I don't think Paul did either. But he was being very clear on that he was speaking of hair length, not of hats or what have you.
It doesn't mean those kind of cultural developments can't happen.
Correct.
In our, for example, today, I don't really do this for I won't. Like in the synagogue, I wear my hat all the time, because I'm that's just, I'm a rabbi, Messianic rabbi. That's part of what I do. I wear a hat. That's part of what people know me as, is the guy, one of men who wears many hats. If I go into a strip mall church, probably not taking off my hat. It's just, but if I go into a very, more formal church, I'll take my hat off. Cause it's just, in that culture, more sign of respect. And usually I have my kippah on anyway. So it's I'm still covered, but it just depends on where you are, and again, context. So much of it depends on where you are, who you're dealing with, who you're with. And go ahead, Toby. Sorry.
I've seen it misused, Paul, by both actually.
Yep.
And I'll give you where I think the church, one of the main ways I think they misuse Paul, which we've kind of recycled it a lot already in the episode, but just give you another example. So in Philippians, Paul kind of gives his resume. That he was born Jewish, and he's from the tribe of Benjamin, and he's telling this to the Gentiles in Philippi because he's saying that your Messiah is Jewish. He goes, I was born as a part of his people. Right. He says I was raised in the same stuff he was raised in, and he kind of talks about how he's a Pharisee, and he goes into that, and then he says this line, but all these things I count as rubbish in comparison to the exceeding. I'm not quoting him perfectly. I don't have a Bible in front of me, but he says all this I count as rubbish and compared to the knowing Messiah.
Right.
So basically what Paul is saying is, compared, if you take everything that I am physically, which is Jewish, and he goes, very few people could beat me at knowledge of the Torah and stuff. He said, so all these are all physical things about Paul. He says, but if I compare all that stuff, all my qualifications, to the knowledge of Messiah, he goes, the knowledge of Messiah is so much greater, So basically, and what he's saying also is, he's saying that that God doesn't accept us based on our pedigree and education and those kinds of things. They're important in certain contexts, but Paul's saying those things don't make me acceptable to God, and it doesn't make me any more or less usable.
Right.
So if you look at just that, it's like Paul's saying that being Jewish doesn't matter, it doesn't count for anything, and God doesn't care. And that's not true. But what Paul is trying to express to the people in Philippi is like, hey, the greatest thing is the knowledge of Messiah.
Right.
But if you go back to Romans, Paul talks about being Jewish not that way. He says, what is the advantage of being a Jew? He says, much in every way. Now, the church misuses the scripture in Philippi to say, you see, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, guys.
Yeah.
The Jewish stuff doesn't matter. See, Paul says it's rubbish. No, he's saying it's rubbish compared to the knowledge of Messiah.
Right.
Now, the Messianic movement I've seen misuse what is the advantage of being a Jew. Oh, man, this one guy I know, whose name I won't mention, loves to lash his Gentiles with, what's the advantage of being Jewish? Hey, guys, much in every way. See, the Bible says it, don't get mad at me, get mad at Paul. And I'm like, that's not what he's saying. He's not saying Jewish people are better. What you're saying is that because you're trying to say, you're putting words in Paul's mouth.
Yeah.
And you're trying to say that Paul's saying that Jews are born with a genetic predilection to loving God.
Yeah.
And that's not true at all.
It's ironically, it's kind of the same thing like anti-Semites do when they like ascribe every ill in the world to the Jewish people, and they're like,
yeah,
the Jews do this. It's like, what? So the Jews are like this immortal, evil presence? Like what? What?
So look at it like this. So like, you have to look at that I think in the historical context. At the time Paul was writing that, the faith was largely Jewish.
Yeah. And
Paul is saying, if you're born Jewish, you likely are born positioned to know the prophets, to know the Torah, to know the writings, and that gives you a pathway to knowing the Messiah, because, you know, as Yeshua says, if you knew the Torah, then you would know it's written about me.
Which is why they have such strong words for the Jewish community that doesn't embrace Yeshua.
So, but now, God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, but what I'm saying is, if you look at my family, like I'm Gentile, my wife's Gentile, my kids are Gentile. We're raising them in the ways of the Lord. Now, you compare our household to a Jewish household where it's an agnostic mother, atheist father, and they're raising their kids to just, whatever. So, do they have the advantage then? No.
Paul talking would be writing today. If he was writing, he'd say, what advantage does Toby's family have?
Right, much in every way. So, you can't... but it amazes me that the same guy said this, Paul. He says, all these things I count as loss, but then he's telling Romans, he goes, hey, what's the advantage of being a Jew? Much in every way. So you have to reconcile these two very different things that Paul is saying about his own people.
Yeah.
And both by themselves aren't correct. But they're correct, you know what I mean. But if you put all of your chips just on one of those, you're going to lose.
Yeah, you're bad hand.
Yeah, you can't lash Gentiles with, "Hey, I'm a Jew. What's my advantage over yours?" But you also can't say, "I'm Jewish." What does that mean? Yeah. Nothing.
And it's a very it's a human problem, because this is part of what. Is it okay if I?
No, please, yeah.
The part of this is what Paul did. This is what Paul is writing about in Romans. And again, if you come with zero historical context to what's happening in Rome at the time Romans is written, you're like, okay, why is he having like a rah Jewish people, but also like, hey, Gentiles, don't think you're better than them. Mm-hmm. And obviously we can read that and be like, oh, like maybe the Gentiles are just being persnickety, whatever, snobbish. But the reality, historically, you have to remember that during this time period, this is when, I believe it's Tiberius, kicks all of the Jews out of Rome for a handful of years. So and this is after Messianic communities have already started. So you have, before that, Jewish synagogues, some of which may have been entirely Messianic at that point. Because again, Rome is kind of ascribed to this, like, the place where the faith really kind of takes off and develops in a strong way. And again, like Toby said, all the leaders are Jewish.
Yeah.
And so suddenly you have communities, Jew and Gentile, and then all the Jews are gone. They're kicked out. So who's going to take those leadership positions? Well, Gentiles. And so, years later, when Paul's writing this letter, the presumption is that Jews had, at this point, been allowed back into Rome. And so now they're coming back. And now it's like, well, do they reassume these positions of leadership? Like, because now you're talking, like, you may have an entire generation of, well, let's say, like, okay, this would be like Rabbi Eric getting kicked out of Pensacola. You know, and because I'm Gentile, I'm here, and all the kids who are now, like, 5 or 6, they grow up into their teen years with me, and then all of a sudden he comes back, and this would be like me acting as if I was somehow superior to Rabbi Eric, like,
just
I've been here, 7 years, where have you been? Not that it was, his fault or anything. And so dealing with that dynamic of, like, well, maybe they're not going to reassume those positions of leadership, but you're not better than them because, because you're here and they're not. Like, it's, don't pit yourself against the Jewish people. It doesn't work that way. It's not God's calling on either of your lives or what the Messianic movement's supposed to be. So, and Paul's letter makes a lot more sense with that background.
Yeah, and you also have to take into account Paul's salvation story, because Paul is a person. You know what I'm saying? He's not. I think that what he was saying was God breathed, but Paul is a human being, and he has his own story. His salvation story was his own, and you have to understand that it was different from, say, mine, or different from yours or anyone else's. Yeah. So Paul, he's coming from that experience too. He's coming from the experience of, I was like super Jew, and not only was I cut at the knees over that, I now am spreading the gospel to Gentiles. Yeah. So I would have loved to have seen some, we have one, I know for sure, if you look in the Bible, the book of Hebrews. Man, it's clear that's being written to Jewish people, and what's it all about? It's all about the Torah.
Yeah.
So you have to,
temple.
I know that sounds really elementary, but you have to understand Paul, he's talking about, when he's talking to Gentiles, he's trying to protect them from using the law to save themselves. Yeah. It's kind of like, and it's taken me a really long time in the movement to kind of figure out, okay, what's a great way to try to explain why the law without making it seem like it's a bad guy. Because again, the church loves to do that, especially, and I love the church. I'm just saying, they love to take the law and go, bad, 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 bad. But I actually heard a pastor recently explain this to his congregation. I thought he did a really good job. He goes, the law, what's its job? He goes, it's like a mirror. He goes, when you look at yourself, what does the mirror do? It informs you, like, say, if your face is dirty. He goes, but do you take the mirror and wipe your face with it?
Yeah.
He goes, no.
You wipe your face off looking in the mirror.
Right. He says, exactly. He goes, that is the law. And I love that, actually. I was like, man, that's really beautiful. That's exactly... that's one of the best ways I've ever heard explained.
Yeah. Truthfully, like, if we were to treat Paul's letters as like what are the things we could come away with as like absolutes that Paul definitely stands on? Like, if we just wanted to make them into doctrinal treatises, like, firmly, the biggest things you would walk away from is Gentiles, quit trying to be Jews to be saved.
Yes.
That's not how it works. Matter of fact, your salvation is in jeopardy if you do. Jews, quit trying to make them Jews. Gentiles, you're not better than Jews.
Jews, you're not better than Gentiles.
Jews, you're not better than Gentiles. That's basically like those. Yeah. That's like a lot of the core competencies you could walk away with. I want to just real quick. Yeah. The other thing too that we have to remember, and this is this might make some people upset, but this is what we do. The Messianic movement is trying to foray into the world as its own thing, as a Jewish thing. Looking at Paul's letters this way is not Jewish. It's Protestant. It's high Protestant. So Lutheran, maybe some of Calvin, some of Zwingli, but definitely Lutheran in nature. This pitting of grace and law is a Lutheran thing, not a Christian thing, not an ancient Christian thing, not a Jewish thing. So, again, keeping that in mind when we say the church, remember this is a fraction of church history that this has been going on. And if we're trying to build into the thing that God has called the Messianic movement to be, then we have to separate from some of the baggage. And again, I get it. A lot of us come from Protestant backgrounds. Most of the Messianic leadership, when this first started out, most of the pioneers were born again into Protestant sects, Protestant denominations, and kind of foraged, kind of splintered off from those to, plant Jewish communities, places where Jews could come and worship as believers in Yeshua and live as Jews worshiping Yeshua. This is a late Protestant development that needs to be left behind. It is not something that we need to use. It's not something that's worked for the church. Yeah. Because all the denominations that embraced that after Luther and on, where are most of those denominations today? Dealing with dealing with things that Paul would write a letter to them for.
Yeah. That Paul already
wrote a letter for. They're elected not to listen to it.
Yeah,
so
it's hilarious. Paul wrote letters to these people about the very things that they're doing.
Yeah. So that's my thing is we have to, treating them as doctrinal treatises it is not messianic. Yeah. It cannot be messianic.
And to that effect, I want to, and this is backtracking to what we said earlier about context. And anytime we deal with Scripture, we're going to hammer on context because it's one of the most important aspects of hermeneutics, in my opinion. But when we look at the Pauline epistles, and realistically, all of the epistles in general fall in this category. But when we look at the Pauline epistles, we can't just look at them in connection to the letters themselves and try and compare them. We have to understand that everything Paul wrote, with exception of his last couple of letters, Timothy, Titus, etc., with exception of those, everything he wrote was written during the time period of Acts 15 to Acts 28. So when we're looking at the Pauline letters, we have to read them in the context of the life of Paul that we see revealed in great detail between Acts 15, a realistic Acts 16, and Acts 28. And all of his letters fall in that time frame somewhere. Keep in mind, Acts 21 is where Paul goes and takes the Nazirite vow at the behest of Yaakov, of James, and the other leaders, Jewish leaders in Jerusalem, goes to the temple to take the Nazirite vow, pays for some other dudes to take it. It wasn't cheap, specifically to show that he wasn't teaching against Torah, particularly for Jewish people, but specifically that he wasn't teaching against Torah. Yet there's all kinds of doctrine based off of his letters written during that very time period that state that the doctrines state that he was teaching against Torah, right? So as a resource, and if I remember, I'll try to remember to put this into the show notes, and if you don't find it in the show notes, shoot us a message on social media so that we can get this to you. But this is just one kind of estimated chronology comparing Acts and the epistles of the New Testament, and it's a blueletterbible.org spreadsheet kind of a deal. And so I'm going to try to remember to put the link for this in. It is very accurate. I'm not saying it's dead on because we're running off of a lot of estimations and such, but it's very handy, very beneficial to look at. You'll see where Paul's journeys fall into place, where Paul's letters were. You'll see kind of how the end of Acts is Paul imprisoned in under Roman authority, and we know that several of his letters were written after or during his imprisonment, more specifically. And so this gives you a clear idea, but it's not just the Pauline epistles, it's all of them. It'll show you where Hebrews falls into the time frame. It'll show you where Peter's letters fall in, and so on and so forth. So I'll try to remember to put that in the show notes. It'd be very beneficial for you in looking at all of the epistles on equal playing field in context of the book of Acts, because the book of Acts is realistically the first, give or take, 60 years and change, roughly, right around 60, 62 years of the body of Messiah. It closes out about 10 to 15 years before the destruction of the temple, which was in 70 Common Era, so it was about 10 years before the destruction
for the
of the
amount
temple.
of time it covers. It's a small book.
Yes, exactly. But very handy when you're trying to interpret Paul's writings. Well, what's Paul's life look like while he's writing this? Is Paul living contrary to the way you're perceiving what he's writing? Well, how do we know? We go back and we look at his life in Acts, and we can kind of see where he is and what's going on and so on. So I'm going to try to remember to put that in the show notes for you, and hopefully that'll be a little extra blessing for you as you're not only listening to this, but doing your own biblical studies as well.
And I wanted to just clarify something I said earlier. When I say the way of handling Paul that to date is very Protestant, that doesn't mean I'm anti-Protestant. It just means as Messianic Judaism is still settling its own identity in the world, the Protestant way of handling Paul's letters doesn't work for us. It can't, and again, I think time has shown that it doesn't work ultimately. So I'm not anti-Protestant. We're thankful for many of the things Protestantism has brought, not only to the world, but to us as a movement. I mean, we largely exist because of the Protestant movement. And again, when I speak of Protestantism, I'm just speaking as a whole, particularly to the Reformation in general.
Yeah. And I just want to say real quick that nobody at this table is saying that we believe parts of the Bible are errant. I will say, though, you can amazingly read the Bible, especially when you look in the Gospels. If you look at John, he is the disciple who Yeshua loved. Now, if you look at that literally, it's like he's saying, well, we're all disciples and we're cool, but John he loved.
Yeah.
So that's very, very individualistic of John.
Right.
He obviously felt like he was very special to Yeshua.
Right.
That doesn't mean that Peter was less special, but John wrote that about himself.
Yeah.
And I think that he's not wrong. He just simply talks about Yeshua loving John. He's saying, I'm the disciple that Yeshua loved. He loved all of them, but John had a penchant for talking about it in his own gospel. And it's the same with, and you also look at Peter and Paul. Mm-hmm. These men had disagreements.
Yeah.
I love that Paul wrote like, hey, I called Peter out and he was wrong. Yeah. And I'm like, so these guys were individual and they're very nuanced. And
they're human.
Yeah. So that doesn't, and again, I say this a lot, I don't know if you guys have ever said, I always say, if you would have told Paul or Peter that their letters and their epistles would be in the same book as the Torah, I think they would flip their lid. They were not intending that.
I had a Christian professor who was, he was a believer himself, but was also, he taught history. Mm-hmm. I think he taught some Bible as well, but he told me, we were talking, in college, the church I attended that was nearby campus, we went to the same church and we had that conversation one day, and he said pretty much almost verbatim what you just said was like, I think Paul would have been like, no, give me back my letters. Let me
right. No. God had other plans.
But to that, I will say to that extent, because again, it's not like we know there was a compiled copy of Paul's letters by the end of the 1st century. Mm-hmm. Like history bears that out. That they were deemed by one of the communities to be important enough to where we have. They were copies, of course, but that it was like, okay, we need a collection of these for whatever reason.
Yeah,
and that's how ultimately when the canon of the Brit Chadashah is finally settled, almost out of need rather than out of necessity. It's all the things that are deemed beneficial, almost in line with what Paul says. All of Scripture is profitable in teaching and instruction. It's all of the things that were written and used, and again, not even all the things that were used, because we know there were other books that are mentioned in writings that weren't included in the canon, that were being used by communities as points of instruction. For example, the Didache is mentioned several times in early writings, and it had a place historically. It had a place within training up, discipling brand new Gentiles coming out of, fresh out of pagandom into what it meant to be a believer in the God of Israel. But I'm thankful that the Holy Spirit guided the men who did put the canon together and said, hey, these are beneficial to the community, to the whole body of Messiah. These are useful, and so we're going to keep them.
I think it would be really helpful if somebody would produce a Bible that was written in a way. For instance, we know the entire Bible is inspired by God.
Yes.
Except possibly the places like where Paul said, not of that, but of me, where Paul is actually writing his own, but it's included in the Bible. And then there's the words that were written or spoken by God in the inspired word.
Yes.
So here's God's word, just that's inspired and written by the authors. And then there's portions that are actually, thus saith God. This is God speaking to Moses. This is God. If those were in like a darker red, and then the words of Yeshua were in red, that same kind of dark red, because this is God speaking.
Right.
This isn't just men writing what God inspired, but this is actually God speaking. And then putting the other writers like Paul in black or whatever. So you can say, okay, this is what God inspired that Moses wrote in Exodus, or Moses wrote. This is when God actually spoke.
Said something. Yeah.
That would be kind of fun to do, is to go and color code and then print print a Bible. You've got the red letter. You're not changing the Bible. Like, hey, you know people at TLV. Maybe you can get them to do a color coded,
a red label, a red letter Bible that actually shows the words of God in the Tanakh and the words of Yeshua in darker red. And then the other parts, because we don't also want to say because it's in black, it's unimportant, because it's still inspired by the Ruach, given by God's Spirit to men to write. But then there's also places where we know that the writer wrote and said, this is my opinion. This is what I'm saying. And that should be understood as, this isn't what God said. It's still included in the inspired text, but it's not the same as God spoke this to my heart and I wrote it down. This is God spoke this, and then while I was writing that, I put this in here.
Yeah, and I know we're getting towards the end of the episode, but you're not going to tell me that you read and follow and apply the book of Ecclesiastes the same way you do, say, Proverbs. You're not going to do that. Ecclesiastes says some wild stuff.
Yeah.
The whole Bible says some wild stuff.
I mean, like Ecclesiastes says stuff like, "Oh, don't be too righteous."
Yeah,
you know, mess numbers. Up a little. You know what I'm saying? So,
Judges.
Like, you're not going to. Now, this is, but yet you can't look at it that way, man.
Right. Yeah. So you have to. I think it'd be really helpful if people. So when you read Paul's letters, you understand Paul is writing it. It's not God speaking it. It's Paul inspired by God, and so Paul's words shouldn't be looked at as if God spoke precisely these words, but that this was what he was saying, and Paul wrote as under the unction of the Spirit.
Right.
But it would let you know, okay, Paul's not more important than Yeshua.
Right.
And that Yeshua and God speaking is the same level, because it's God speaking, whereas Paul or Isaiah or it would be God inspired, but not the exact words that God, like we're writing what God spoke, like we're taking notes of what he said and sharing it with everybody like a scribe would, versus thus saith God. Like these words were audibly spoken by God to somebody.
Yeah, and it's like, and again, I'm not trying to start, you could probably do two parts of this episode, because you're now getting into what I think is really interesting. Like when people, talk to me about, say, the book of Ezekiel, when I'm talking about it, I'm like, if you read Ezekiel, that's some wild stuff. But you have to understand, that is how Ezekiel, a human being, that's how he processed what he saw. It's not a real wheel. I think it's something else. Yeah. But Ezekiel was just like, it's a wheel.
Yeah, something happening in the angelic.
Yeah, I don't think John physically ate a book in Revelation, but something. That's how John perceived. These guys are seeing wild stuff.
Yeah,
but if Ezekiel was literal, dude's got some weird visions on angels, man. Those dudes are.
No, I didn't think about that plays to the same point. It's it doesn't mean that God has a bunch of weird, freaky things walking around him. I think we, human beings, are looking at something that is impossible to fully grasp. You know, and Ezekiel's just like, this is what
it
I
would
saw.
be like, for instance, there's a text that says a locust was shooting fire out of its mouth. Now, that could actually be a locust shooting fire out of its mouth. He could actually have seen that. Or he could have seen into the future a jet plane shooting missiles.
Or a helicopter.
Or a helicopter shooting missiles.
Exactly.
And said, "What? I don't know what that is."
He doesn't know what and God didn't say that's a helicopter. Just wait a little bit.
Yeah. That's an Apache, boy.
And I'm not saying which one is right. I'm just saying that when we look at it, we have to understand that they're seeing something they've never seen and describing it in words they think we will understand.
Yes.
Yeah.
And with that, I think we're going to wrap up this segment. Thanks for joining us in this. If you have any comments or thoughts, feel free to write it on whatever format you're listening to. If you have any questions you'd like us to talk about, let us know. And please, if Rabbi David forgets to put the information in the link,
blow us up.
Make sure you blow up his cell phone till he does it. And we'll catch you next time. Shalom.
Thank you for listening to the MessianTics podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at MessianTics Podcast.